In class the other day, I had a definition of what a culture was, and we, very simply to recap, defined culture are learned patterns that are passed down from generation to generation and shared amongst a larger community. This is a lecture that usually is part of the lecture that you already had in class, and it takes the concept of culture and gives us some further distinctions or definitions. So I'm going to take a few minutes to make this as a separate lecture that you can look at your leisure. All right, so there's three different kinds of culture that I want to identify because they're going to be really important, especially when we get into conflict. The first is what's called a dominant culture. And a dominant culture, by definition, is the one that's in power. The dominant culture had different terms and has different terms. Certainly, umbrella culture is a common word that's actually very common in the United States to refer to something as an umbrella culture. Mainstream culture also has been a word that's been used. I think probably the best term that I like, and of course finding a clip art on mainstream is really hard, so that's why you just have the umbrella. So note that a dominant culture could also be called an umbrella culture. But I think the word dominant culture is a better word because I think it implies a couple of things which are really important, especially when we start talking about cultural values and cultural orientations in other cultures, that not everybody necessarily feels that way. So the dominant culture, so it is found in most cultures. That would be a true-false question that would be true. Dominant cultures can be found in most, if not all cultures. So it is the group that has a couple of talking points here. The first is that the dominant culture usually has the greatest amount of control over how the culture conducts its business. Let me say that again. So the dominant culture usually has the greatest amount or more amount of control over how the culture actually conducts its business. And that's everything from communications to banking to everything else. It's also thought that the dominant culture is the one that has the power that allows it to speak for an entire culture. So it's not that it speaks for an entire culture. Just wanted to keep a short tag on this slide. It doesn't necessarily speak for the entire culture, but it possesses the power that allows it to speak for the entire culture. So, whatever president is in power, that's the one that we assume is the voice of authority. And of course, everything that's part of that dominant culture, then we assume that they're speaking for everyone. And as we know, a lot of people sort of disagree with what the dominant culture is telling us right now. The next is that the dominant culture will set the tone and the agenda that other people that are in that culture will follow or will usually follow. And this ranges from, again, the policies and procedures we have to sort of the overarching values, the idea that what does it mean to be a success in the United States? We sort of know that for most people. If you ask them, it'll be, making a lot of money or being able to retire early, in part because you are making a lot of money. And it's not necessarily the case with everyone, but it does sort of set the agenda of what we talk about and how we talk about those things and the tone that we use when we talk about those things. And again, I think if you look at administrations, the presidential administrations, you can see how each president sets a different tone. So just because a person's president doesn't mean that, the president that comes after is going to communicate the way the president before did, and the president before them, and the president before them. And finally, the dominant culture usually consists of those who have historically controlled everyone else. And in addition to that, not only have they historically controlled people, but they continue to control people. They continue to control society. They continue to control the kind of communication that we have and the policies that we have. So that sort of brings up the question, well, gosh, who's been in control all this time? Well, no big surprise. It's been white men over 40. So you don't need to know that much about history to know that white men over 40 have pretty much governed this country since we broke away from England, and even before we broke away from England, they still continue to be the dominant culture. Interestingly, white men over 40 make up less than 40% of the overall population in the United States. So it's really not about numbers, and the power is not found in numbers. The power is found in control. So the fact that they have control and they maintain control. Moving on to the next distinction that I want to make is what's called a co-culture. So co-cultures, I think I would label them as being different but similar. So there's enough similarity that they can be considered aspects of a dominant culture. I mean, clearly I'm not a white man over 40, but do I do some things or am I allowed some privileges that make me part of a dominant culture, I would say yes. White privilege is a real thing, and although I'm not a man, I have benefited from the fact that I'm a white person. So a couple of points I want to make about this as well. The first is that the groups and social communities that are part of a co-culture exhibit communication traits that are sufficiently different from the dominant culture. All right. So a couple of examples here, and again, so they share patterns of communication, and that may be value patterns as well of the dominant culture. I have two vintage photographs here. I chose vintage photographs so that I could keep some clarity and focus on this discussion. If we were in class, I might have done something a little different. But certainly farmers. Farmers would be considered and are still considered a co-culture. They have, there's, plenty of white men over 40 that are farmers, but they also have, particular agenda. They follow a particular agenda of what they feel is important and not important. So their values may be slightly different. What they feel is important in the world may also be slightly different. The same was true of the Black Panthers in the late 60s, early 70s. You could say the same thing for the Black Lives Matter movement now. It would also be considered a co-culture. So do people who support the Black Lives Matter movement, do they share patterns of the dominant culture? Sure, they do. A lot of the values may be very similar. People want to work hard. They want to, make some money, take care of their families. They're religious, Christian in particular, because that is the dominant religion in the United States. But there's also some very significant differences in terms of philosophy and in terms of viewpoint on how this world is being run, or how the United States is being run, really, and how things need to change. So that would make the African American community could be defined as a co-culture. And they may also have very distinct patterns of communication. I think a good example of this, and I'm only going into just a couple of different co-cultures, one would be the deaf and hard of hearing, have a distinct pattern of communication. They have sign language, and the rules of engagement for them are a little bit different. I can turn my back and still be talking to somebody who is a hearing person, but if a person is deaf or hard of hearing, then they can't hear me at all, and then that's a sign of disrespect. So, the LGBTQ community, which may also be a co-culture, in part because they have as much political influence and they have as much influence on what goes on in society as the dominant culture, may also have very unique styles of communication and particular ways of communicating. And these affiliations for co-culture can be based on race, they can be based on gender, age, sexual preference, all of the above. They would be considered a co-culture. And then finally, we come to the third distinction, which is one that's a bit archaic now. It's not used in the way at which it was meant to be used. You might see psychology books or sociology books still talk about this term, which is subculture, which is really more distinct than a co-culture. So co-culture really can overlap with the dominant culture. The subculture is a bit more different. So the term was first used in the 1920s at the University of Chicago. And of course, the University of Chicago at that time was a major hub for psychology and sociology research. So that's where that term is coming from. A little bit of history, there you go. And it really refers to deviant behavior. So again, the term deviant, which really means just deviating from the norm, it implies a whole bunch of other things. But the idea of deviant behavior being, for example, in the 1960s, the hippie movement, the flower power movement in the 1960s was definitely a move away from acknowledging the values that society had at that point, which was you follow the path, you go to college, you get married, you have a house and a spouse and 2.5 kids and, a dog or a cat in the yard. That was sort of the way things were. But then during the late 1960s, you had a major influx of different philosophy and different ideology and different lifestyle. So now people who were embracing this lifestyle moved to San Francisco, to the Haight-Ashbury in particular. You could Google that and you will find all kinds of photos of, people living, doing what I think a lot of people are now doing, is like living together in sort of free love. And, the idea of polyamory was probably, although it wasn't called polyamory, was probably really big in the late 1960s. I don't know, I wasn't quite old enough. So that would be an example of a subculture, would be hippies in the 1960s would be a subculture. Oddly enough, when I looked this definition up, because I wanted to make sure that I was accurate, people that totally embrace fictional worlds are also considered a subculture. So it might be that they have very unique communication patterns. So I have here, for those of you that aren't really keen on Star Trek, these are the original Star Trek outfits. And so people who dress up in Star Trek uniforms and go to conventions and role play, that would be considered a subculture. People who dress up on those big furry animal suits and go have big furry conventions, I think they're called furries, but I'm not sure. I don't do that. But that would also be considered a subculture. They have particular ways of communicating with each other, not necessarily in the bigger world. So it might be that the subculture is one that you can sort of put on, go do whatever it is you're doing that's making you happy, and then you kind of take it off at the end of the day, and you're still part of a subculture. So if I look at these people in this photograph of the Star Trek picture, I'm imagining a lot of them have, what we would call sort of mainstream jobs. They're teacher, doctor, student, business person. They're probably any number of those, careers. So the term subculture might refer to, a particular way of looking at the world, but not to the exclusion of the bigger world. But on the other hand, and this is why the term subculture gets really messy, is that many times a subculture will reject the values of the dominant culture. So like the hippies in the 1960s, that would be a good example. It might be there was a goth subculture a number of years ago, which sort of moved away from everything else. If we look at things like hipsters now or millennials, they would not be considered subcultures. They would probably be considered co-cultures if you want to define them that way. Another possible subculture would be Hell's Angels, for example. And this is another benchmark of the concept of subculture, is that they are many times, though not always, based on control of territory. So Hell's Angels they have a certain territory. They have certain restaurants and bars that they go to, and they have, they all travel in packs down the freeway. The same would be said of gang culture. So gang culture would be also, if you were to look that up, that would be a very close example of what a subculture would be. So it's kind of rejecting the values of the dominant culture, more often than not rejecting those values and embracing a different kind of lifestyle. So that's what subculture would be. So there you have it, three more terms that I think are important as we move forward in class, being dominant culture, which is the one that is in power, not necessarily the one that has the largest number. Co-culture, which again, you could be part of several co-cultures at any given time. If you're a Christian, then that's a co-culture. If you're an atheist, that's a co-culture. If there's a number of other ways we could define that. If you're a gamer, that's a co-culture. And then finally, subculture, which is probably the one that's more distinct in terms of behavior and communication than the other two. So feel free to email me if you have any questions. We can certainly, in class, if there's some questions, we can cover those as well. But either way, feel free to get those questions answered. That's it for this lecture, and we'll move on to cultural orientations, which will be in class.